We have tried to, even at the point of being a community group, treated this as seriously as possible and made sure what we've created to be as evidence-led as possible.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams. Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, where we bring you the latest news and insights from the world of sustainable software development. I'm your host, Chris Adams. Green software covers a lot of different kinds of software, and today we're checking in on the work of a group of fellow travelers in the world of web development, and more specifically, the World Wide Web Consortium. If you're not familiar with the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, it's effectively the place where people who build the web define how the web works, and where standards like HTML works, how CSS works, and how they're made accessible, and so on. And long before the Green Software Foundation existed, there was the W3C Sustainable Web Design Community Group, chaired by Tim Frick at the agency Mighty Bytes, who was also the author of the O'Reilly book, Designing for Web Sustainability. And in the last few years, there's been a real uptick in activity in this group with the creation of the W3C Web Sustainability Guidelines and regular monthly community calls to coordinate the work on developing more sustainable web development practices. So what exactly are the Web Sustainability Guidelines and who are they for? If you cared about sustainability in the digital realm, why would you try getting involved in a group like the W3C in the first place? How does this even change the way people build the web and consume web services? And how do we make them more sustainable? Joining us today are two key figures from the W3C to help us explore these themes. Alex Dawson, one of the editors of the Web Sustainability Guidelines at the W3C, and Tzviya Siegman, the W3C's new sustainability lead. So in alphabetical order, Alex, you win here. So I'm just going to hand over to you to briefly introduce yourself before we hand over to Tzviya. Is that okay?
Yep, that's fine. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Dawson, and I'm an invited expert in the W3C's Sustainable Web Interest Group. And as Chris has mentioned, I'm the editor of the Web Sustainability Guidelines. And I've also recently been involved in co-authoring the upcoming sustainability chapter in this year's Web Almanac.
Cool. Thanks for that, Alex. Tzviya, can I give you the floor to do the same?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Tzviya Siegman. I'm the sustainability lead at W3C. I recently joined the staff of W3C, but I've been involved for more than 10 years. I also do member engagement in North America. I've recently been involved in setting up the interest group in W3C and getting used to being on the staff instead of being a member.
Cool. Thanks, Tzviya. And if you're new to this podcast, my name is Chris Adams. I am the host of this podcast, but I'm also the executive director at the Green Web Foundation. I also work inside the Green Software Foundation as one of the chairs of the policy working group as well. And I'm one of the maintainers of the library CO2JS, a tool that's used in a number of digital sustainability projects. Before we dive into this conversation, here's a quick reminder that we're going to share a transcript of this and links to all the projects that are just mentioned in our show notes. And you'll need to look for that on podcast.greensoftware.foundation to find that. So if you're listening to this via Spotify or YouTube, you might not find them. So please remember to look that up there. All right. So with that, I think the two of you are sitting comfortably, right? Alex, maybe I'll just hand over to you. So last time, around about this time last year, I believe you joined us with Faubry, and you spoke to us about the second draft of the Web Sustainability Guidelines. And most recently, I saw you presenting at the Green I/O London conference about, again, web sustainability and specifically the process of making these guidelines for people to follow. So as I understand it, you're now at, is it draft 8 or possibly draft 9? So I'd like to ask a little bit about how they get built. But before we do that, could you just give a brief summary of what the Web Sustainability Guidelines are to the uninitiated?
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, the Web Sustainability Guidelines are an evidence-based set of advisory guidelines. Many people may be aware of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as sort of founding principles of accessibility. And we've kind of followed a similar set of principles, but designing and creating them for the sustainability community. And they've been in development for about 3 years now. And obviously, they are to assist those who want to make digital products and services more sustainable through practical techniques. And obviously, the science is developing rapidly, as is the sustainability field, and of course, legislative compliance targets. So it's a much needed feature that the web really requires. And, it's a sort of global growing focus as climate change is becoming a ever more important topic of discussion.
Cool, thanks. All right, there's 2 full-on questions I might ask. So first of all, you spoke about the Web Sustainability Guidelines. That's quite a mouthful. Is it okay to call them like the WSGs? Is there a short term that we should use for that?
Yep, WSGs is perfectly fine. We use WSG as our sort of, acronym.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
So I use WSG, a bit like the kind of Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or sometimes the WCAG, right? I'll call it. So WCAG and WSG, got it. Yeah. Okay. And also, I know that you're at Green I/O, the conference. It's like one of the places to be going to if you're going to speak about digital sustainability. How was that? How did you find it?
Yeah, it was amazing, really. I mean, you were there yourself. It was definitely the place to be. It was sort of like the Woodstock of sustainability. Pretty much anyone and everyone who could be there managed to sort of cram in the place, standing room only at the back of the conference room. There were sort of all the faces from all the sort of major players that could sort of get there. Yeah, it was a pretty amazing event. All credit to sort of Gail and getting sort of everybody involved in the conference. It was pretty much the event of the year as far as digital sustainability goes.
So you enjoyed that? Good.
Definitely, yeah.
All right, okay. And Tzviya, if I hand over to you, as I understand it, you work at the W3C and you're the new sustainability lead. And part of your day job is essentially guiding the existing community group that created some of these guidelines. But there's also work to create a more formal, I think they're called interest groups, which is slightly different. We'll explore that a little bit later on. But before we do that, can I just backtrack to talk about how you ended up working as a sustainability lead in the W3C? Because I had no idea there was one until I heard about your involvement in this. And honestly, I was quite pleased because it's been something inside the W3C's like architectural guidelines, their tag. They said the web should be sustainable. And now they've actually got someone who's talking about this. So that was really, really nice to hear. So yeah, how'd you get into this? What's the story that this came about?
I'll give you a short history of my career. I started working in standards back in 2008. I worked at a short publishing company, and I was doing the digital side of things, looking at XML, and all of a sudden, ebooks became a thing. And it was, oh my goodness, Tzviya needs somebody to work on this. And we created 100 based on PDF OCR, and I was like, this doesn't really look right. Maybe I can fix it. And I did. In order to fix it, you need to read standards. And the whole ebook program came under my leadership, and I was not very high up in the food chain of that point. Eventually, I started working on the standards with an organization called the International Digital Publishing Forum, because that's where EPUB was at the time. And over the next 6 years, the IDPF merged with the W3C, and I became the chair of the publishing working group. And then I joined the W3C's advisory board, and then I became chair of the advisory board, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I got laid off. And I worked with some people within the W3C to develop this role because I have become interested in sustainability. All along, I've been working in accessibility. And the part of technology that's always really interested me is not necessarily creating faster products. Time to market was always something that annoyed me. Working with, the product managers and things like that my job in publishing, I was always frustrated when issues like accessibility got thrown to the side because there was a new feature being developed. It's nice to have a new feature, but if it's not accessible, if it doesn't have primary work, yeah. And so sustainability is in that area as well. I used to work on what a former manager of mine called the ILIDs, accessibility, sustainability. And now I'm still, this is living the dream. So I was able to sculpt this job at the W3C, which is really a dream for me. And the fact that sustainability is mentioned in the W3C's vision, I'll take a little credit for that because I was one of the people who wrote that. So just a little credit because there are lots of people involved in writing that. But here we are, and we are really excited to be working on sustainability in an interest group, which you mentioned is not quite the same as the work you will like. You mix some new differences now or later. But we're working on a specification, which I can explain the different types of specifications. But I'm really excited to lead in the community group into something more formal than not just a note. Even had a lot of uptake where we're able to formalize it in an interest group with W3C.
I see. Okay, so it sounds like this is not your first rodeo. You've been through the process of seeing how standards get developed, and this is why you being involved with this helps, because there may be a bunch of people who might be curious about this and have all things kind of wish for, but you've seen how this works. You've seen how the sausage gets made, and that's some of your role is to help steer some of that through, so we end up with something that people actually can use and adopt in their work and things like that then.
Yeah, absolutely. The work in W3C, when it's an interest group or working group, goes through a pretty rigorous process. And I can talk about that process now or into it and you've got literature.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Okay. Thanks for that, Tzviya. So hopefully we've caught up the audience to where we are today, November 2024. We spoke a little bit about the history. And I teased about the creation of this new group, like an interest group that has some more formal backing within the W3C. So for people who are not au fait with how web standards are formed or what an interest group is compared to a community group, can you maybe just explain a little bit about why this is a big deal and what it makes possible that wasn't before? Tzviya, I'll hand over to you, then maybe Alex will come in with some specific examples because he was the author of the guidelines.
Yeah, thank you. I'll talk a little bit about what it is that we try to accomplish with standards and what that means in W3C. In W3C, standards require interoperable implementations. Interoperable is achieved by testable implementations, where we test things to make sure that they work in at least 2 instances. Sometimes standards are codified by regulatory bodies. We see this with something like USB-C and the EU. We also see this with WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, being pointed to by various legislation. There are a lot of standards like WCAG where this is pointed to. In the W3C, we have community groups. Well, anybody can start a community group. It doesn't have the formal structure of a W3C group. It's people get together, they work on things, and it's the incubation process, we call it, or just people get together because they believe in.
Okay.
An interest group has the authorization of the W3C's advisory committee. Everybody has to vote on the work. A member of each W3C member organization has the ability to vote yes or no, or maybe yes, but I would like to see this then changed on the formation of an interest group. And an interest group can write statements. A working group is when it's the same thing with the advisory committee, but they actually have the recommendation track, which is what W3C officially calls standards. The sustainability group is an interest group where they write in statements because the web sustainability guidelines include a lot of things that are not necessarily testable, although there are a lot of testable statements in there. And I'll turn it over to Alex to talk about how we'll proceed with that.
Okay, thanks for that, Tzviya. So if I just paraphrase that for people, there's almost like an escalating layer of authority or formality that comes through this. And it may be that the bar is somewhat higher with the things that get published by an interest group compared to a community group. And like there's a escalating scale all the way up to having like full-blown standards. And this is like the midway point. And like, Alex, if that's about right, I'll hand over to you, Alex, and maybe you can chime in on some of it because, yeah, you were very hands-on in writing some of these, perhaps.
Yeah, obviously, we are trying to be as rigorous as possible because throughout the creation process, we have tried to, even at the point of being a community group, treated this as seriously as possible and made sure what we've created to be as evidence-led as possible. And we are still in the process of trying to create as much measurability data as we can, which is something that we are going to be increasingly focused upon as an interest group. So with regards to testability, which is something that obviously interest groups, having testable implementations, it's not something that we have to be as strict upon. We still want to make sure our work is as rigorous and testable as possible, because there may come a point in the future that we may want to have that testable compliant state for working what we have created in with legislative conformance, and being able to do so may require at some point, obviously in the far future, taking our work from an interest group state to a working group state to get that recommendation status. But that is something, in the far off distant future, as Tzviya will probably nod and agree with. But for the moment, obviously, we want to focus on making what we have created as rigorous as possible, purely because anyone who is going to utilize our work, we want to have the best quality evidence for anything we are submitting as guidance. We want to be able to tell people using our work, this is the best way that you can implement something in your product or service, because the evidence shows that this will have the greatest impact in terms of sustainability. And it's something that we've been very much focused upon when creating the web sustainability guidelines from the offset, which is why we've got so many references within our work. We've got, quite a lot of material relating to things like GRI and such. So it's something that we've been very much focused upon from the offset.
Okay, and by GRI, you're referring to the Global Reporting Initiative here, right? So that's one of the other groups that talk about, okay, this is how you set out what counts as sustainable, for example, and they've done a bunch of work that you're referring to with that one there, yeah?
Yeah, it's one of the measures that we've been utilising alongside, obviously, academic material and many other forms of tooling as well.
Okay. All right, thanks for that, Alex. So I'll just maybe touch on that a little bit more, because one thing that I know that we've seen, like in France, for example, there are something like guidelines which are kind of mandated for government websites now. And it sounds like you might be looking for something like that on a more international scale that could be adopted in other parts of the world. And I mean, for folks who are new to this, the W3C has like a public mailing list. And if you look on there, you'll see like there are people from, say, I think Singapore, the government of Singapore basically said, hey, we're looking for some standards like this or something for us to adopt. And I know there are people in other parts of the world who are basically saying, I want to push for this, but I need some kind of something, either like a standard or a set of guidelines that I can ask my team to be following. And it sounds like that's the kind of push, because I know the WSGs have been in some kind of usable form now, but it feels like this seems to be a real push for adoption to get larger organizations to use them who commission significant projects. And we spoke about how these might not be standards with a capital S. There might be a kind of guidance for sustainable software, but in terms of providing a reasonable expectation of what you can expect a responsible practitioner to do, that seems to be what they'd be shooting for. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what adoption looks like here, and maybe we can hear some stories about organizations expressing interest in adopting these and what that process looks like, because this is a new field, and I know that we've just spoken about how different places are looking for this. And Alex, I suspect you've been in some of these conversations. So maybe if I hand over to you, and then maybe let Tzviya chime in, because she's seen this happen a few times outside of just sustainability.
Yeah, in terms of adoption, meeting the success criteria is rather open to interpretation at this point. I mean, as I've mentioned, we're aiming to improve measurability data as an interest group, so we can better sort of lead by evidence regarding if a particular technique has a greater impact or not. And that's sort of on the horizon. Currently, we sort of follow a similar practice to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines with their accessibility techniques, and much of that can be seen in our STAR supplement, Sustainable Tooling and Reporting, as that outlines some optional techniques that are currently deemed where appropriate machine testable, so can be sort of repeated and used to showcase which success criteria can be repeatable and implementable to meet certain success criteria within the particular guidelines. Now, obviously, you don't have to follow them. They're not sort of gospel, and we're working to sort of improve them where we can along the pathway. But we've been sort of trying to improve upon this to sort of help people in terms of general adoption. And regarding sort of interest from the public and private sector, we've had quite a lot of interest, definitely, from various organisations. I mean, I have been sort of trying to keep track wherever possible, and there have been a number of agencies globally that have already mentioned that they have been starting to utilise and implement our work, and there have been a lot of government departments who have got in touch who are either openly interested in utilising what we have created, even though it's in draft formats, or have interest in actually for tracking our progress or getting on board with what we've created potentially for what could be future compliance. So it's good signs and sort of generally good feeling, if nothing else, that we're potentially on the right track with what we have been creating.
Okay, all right. So if I understand that correctly, so I spoke about how France they've set out some standards themselves already to say like all our websites made by the public sector have to meet these standards. In other parts of the world, there might be people saying, well, we're going to set some of this, and rather than write all this stuff ourselves, we'll refer to these things as like, we'll refer to that as that's what we're going to hold as our bar that everything needs to meet, for example. That's what some of this stuff is. It seems to be like the direction that's heading in. Okay. So that gives you some idea of how that might work. But Tzviya, I'll hand over to you, because obviously it's a bit more complicated than that. And like we can ask for certain things, but that's not the same as people actually adopting this stuff. For example, like if it was, well, we would see a probably more accessible web, for example. So Tzviya, can I like hand over to you to talk a little bit about like actually adoption and how this happens, or if there's any things that you've learned over the last few years that you might share that could help here?
So adoption is a really complicated topic. Something that I think many people find shocking when they start looking on standards is that we can write standards in an incredibly idealistic way, but we can't actually make anybody use them. It's very frustrating. This is why the implementation tests are important. But even with testing, we can't promise adoption. And that's why it's important for everybody working on this to become evangelists. And I often say that my job is really evangelism. And a lot of people who are working on sustainability come from the world of accessibility, because the role is very similar in terms of evangelism. And it's really important to make sure that this set of issues is a high priority. People who are working on browsers, servers, and in their organizations, like you might have an HR department who has a goal of, let's say, reducing carbon emissions because that's what everybody says, because as Tim Frick likes to say, they have carbon tunnel vision. They'll say they're reducing carbon by 30% by 2030, to just kick a number. But they don't know what that means. We need to get to the developers who are actually writing the code, and we need to get to the people who are building the servers and so on, so that they can actually do the work. Because the people at HR or the CEO or whoever it is who's making these commitments don't have the tools to do this. Our guidelines give us some of the tools, and the guidelines are divided into sections so that this touches a lot of different departments in an organization. And we're trying to break them down so that people can pull out the different sections that are relevant to them. But that adoption step is really important. I'll also say that what you were talking about, Chris, where different governments might be able to point to the guidelines, that's really where adoption is important. But it also comes down to being able to educate people, and we're also going to be working on different education materials. I love WCAG, I'm a big fan, but a lot of people are deeply critical of WCAG because it's so hard to understand. So we're trying to make ours a lot easier to understand, and hopefully we'll be able to be really successful with that.
Okay, thanks for that, Tzviya. So so there's two things that kind of came out of that. So one of them was about, Alex, you spoke about these things being testable, and presumably this is some of the stuff that you might see when people are using, say, web page test, which has like carbon control or eco-grid or some of these things. If you can test for something, then you can provide some guidance as part of like the analysis process, or you can automate this and check, like, has this got better or has it got worse? That's what some of the kind of testability things presumably would afford, right? That's what you were kind of referring to with some of that. And that might be something that you're essentially able to like enforce a standard on, or make sure it's meeting the standard that you've set out in some kind of agreement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If we can provide something that's testable or something that people can utilize, then it's something that tool makers, people creating products and services, can implement with what they're creating. And that will obviously help us do our job, because for people creating tools like, Website Carbon, EcoGrader, they can filter that down into their processes so that rather than individuals having to read an extensive specification, with a few clicks of a button, it can provide feedback through reports, potentially tools that can be integrated within IDEs like Visual Studio Code, things that could be integrated within browsers, such as the, dev tools environments within, say, Google Chrome and Firefox and such. Lighthouse Project is a prime example. These are things that if it's machine testable, it can be integrated within tooling, and that will help take a lot of the friction out of people being able to quickly identify where the problems are occurring, how much of a problem it is, and how to identify what resolution needs to be.
What kind of remedial action you might take.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks for that. Okay. So that helps summarize that. And Tzviya, you were talking a little bit about, okay, different groups might have different stakeholders, and you're referring to public sector as one group that might have legally binding targets. For example, we know that like in the UK, they have a target to reduce emissions by however much. And in Europe, it's reduced emissions by 55% by the end of, in 5.5 years' time, for example. I mean, I'm speaking to you in the middle of an election, so there's a difference but like up until yesterday, there was a whole thing about the federal government being the single biggest purchaser of green energy, which was forcing a kind of switch to cleaner energy, for example, things like that. That seems to be what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, there's public and private, but there's also different stakeholders such as product managers versus developers, individuals within an organization.
Ah, I see. So like when you've got product managers, if they know what to ask for, they're able to that helps inform that conversation with the team they're working with and say, can we please agree to meet these standards or have something like that? They don't need to be the specialists themselves to know that if there's a standard or set of guidelines out there, that at least gives a shared set of minimum standards that the work's going to be run at, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. That provides a bit more guidance about, I guess, a theory of change behind some of this. So we're just starting to come up to time, and I wondered if we might be able to look forward to like what's on the horizon in the world of sustainable web development. And if there's anything that you folks have that maybe if I was to ask you, what should be on an interested listener's radar if they were interested in web sustainability? If I hand over to you, Alex, first, and then over to you, Tzviya, is there anything like what should people be looking out for between now and the end of the year, for example, or perhaps in Q1 2025? What's on your list, Alex?
I think the thing that's dominating everybody's discussion at the moment is just sort of AI, isn't it, really? Everyone's talking about it. It's causing a lot of discussions around sort of how big an impact it's going to have. And it's pretty much going to be the dominating discussion around, how we're going to sort of wrangle around it in terms of legislation and measurement and tooling and optimization and such. So I think that's going to be a major sort of domineering factor, especially considering how much infrastructure it's currently absorbing in terms of building new facilities and such. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. And are there any particular projects or things that you're expecting to, any releases by projects you follow or any big things like that that you would direct people to? So they've been listening to this and they might want to find like a follow-on link or follow-on project to look into. What would you direct people to if they found something that's interesting and would want to go somewhere else next?
There's not a particular one, especially that I've been following. I mean, if I find any useful links or materials, normally it gets sucked straight into our project, into the Web Sustainability Guidelines, because we have nicely organized references for any useful material that can help people make decisions and such. So I always like to point people to the guidelines, to the latest release, because I, nicely garden those links and keep them up to date with all the latest material relating to sustainability. We've got sort of about 1,500 odd links, all nicely categorized for people interested in sustainability. Yeah, it's probably the largest digital sustainability reference library on the web.
Blimey. Okay. All right. And Tzviya, is there anything that you might kind of direct people's attention to? Like, we've spoken all about interest groups and community groups, but like, they still run, right? Like they happen in the, is it monthly? I mean, how, if someone wants to find out about this, what's the process like to start getting involved in any of this stuff, for example?
I'll provide links for both the interest group and the community group in W3C. For the community group, you don't need to be a member. For the interest group, you need to be a member of W3C or be what's called an invited expert, which means provide a reason that we should be invited and get it reviewed by me and the chairs of the interest group, and then show that you'll do the work. Also, something that I'll be working on in the next year or so is creating a horizontal review program for the W3C and sustainabilities. The W3C prides itself on doing horizontal review on all standards in the areas of accessibility, privacy, security, and internationalization, meaning we'll take the example of accessibility. There's a review of every single specification to make sure that the specification itself is accessible, and we'll introduce accessibility problems. So I have the job of creating this for sustainability.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just check? Because I'm not sure I'm familiar with the horizontal. Is the idea there being that you've got 3 or 4 standards and you want them to be consistent with each other? Is that what horizontal reviews, or is there something else?
Horizontal review means that, so let's say you had a new CSS specification, there are dozens of those every year. There's an accessibility checklist for the people in the CSS working group to take a look at. And then they have the opportunity to speak with the people who are experts in accessibility to make accessibility issues onto the web. So I will be working to create a sustainability horizontal review checklist. I don't know yet how I'll be doing this, but that's part of my job as sustainability lead. I'm very excited about this because this has not been done before. So we want to make sure that the W3C is not bringing new sustainability issues to the web.
Oh, I see. Okay. So if I check if I understand that, and maybe this is one concrete example, I know that there are certain bits of CSS, like there's certain filters that if you run them, you can basically cook that CPU on your laptop. I think Florian at Mozilla, he's one of the people who built the Firefox profiler. He has this kind of party trick where he basically takes you to a single web page and it triggers one thing which just like cooks your machine because it just runs all the cores really, really hard, basically, just because it's doing a kind of gentle group. It sounds like something a bit like that. Like if someone's going to introduce a feature, they're aware of some of the knock-on impacts, or they might have okay, I think I understand that now.
So, and I'm going to just remind Alex that he's working on the Web Almanac.
Yeah.
And maybe you want to plug that.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got the new edition of the Web Almanac, which will be coming out this month. I've contributed to the sustainability chapter, and anyone who's interested in sustainability will be wanting to check out the results of that. So, yeah.
Cool. And for people who are not familiar with the Web Almanac, this is essentially a bit like a kind of state of the web. Every year it comes out, tells everyone what's going on. So you've been saying, you essentially it's state of sustainability of the web. That's what your chapter's focusing on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, if that's visible, we'll share a link to that in the show notes. But anyone who's curious, Web Almanac seems like a fairly easy term to search in your chosen search engine. Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we've got a good few pointers, and we'll also link to some of the community groups that we spoke about here. I suspect there's a conversation to have about how the GSF should work with the W3C for some of the groups there, because I know we spoke of AI and there's a GSF, Green Software Foundation working group specifically focused on AI. May make sense to do something along those lines for web specifically, because it's another clear sector and a clear application of software. So just before we go, maybe I should ask, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where should people be looking? Tzviya, if I start with you, where should go? Is there a LinkedIn page or something like that you'd direct people to?
Sure. I'll drop my LinkedIn page. It's linkedin.com/Tzviya, I think. And there's also my bio on the W3C staff page, which I don't remember the URL off the top of my head, but I'll find out.
Okay, cool. And Alex, for you as well?
Yep, mine's pretty straightforward. You can find my details on my website, and my name is my URL, so it's alexanderdawson.com.
All right, that seems nice and easy to Google and look up. And Alexander and Dawson are spelt like you would expect them to be spelt as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, folks, thank you so much for giving us a bit of a kind of deep dive into the world of the W3C and how web standards get made and how they can be adopted. And wish you best of luck. Hopefully, I'll see you at one of another community groups or the meetings every month. And yeah, hope you have a nice week. All right, take care, folks. Ta-ra.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.